Contributions to the Organic Historical Representation of the Marxist Revolutionary Theory, from the pamphlet Sul Filo del Tempo, number 1, May 1953. This is split into Reunion of Milan, September 7, 1952, The Historical Invariance of Marxism, The False Resource of Activism. Then, The Reunion of Forlì, December 28, 1952, Theory and Action, The Immediate Revolutionary Program. And finally, Reunion of Genova, April 26, 1953, Multiple Revolutions, the Anti-Capitalist Revolution in the West. Beginning with the historical invariance of Marxism. 1. We use the expression Marxism not in the sense of a doctrine discovered or introduced by the person Karl Marx, but in reference to a doctrine which arose with the modern industrial proletariat and which accompanies it throughout the course of social revolution. And although the term Marxism has been speculated upon and massively exploited by a series of anti-revolutionary movements, we nevertheless retain it. 2. Marxism, in the only valid sense of the word, is faced today by three main groups of adversaries. First group, those bourgeois who claim that the mercantile capitalist type of economy is the ultimate one, that its historical overcoming of the socialist mode of production is a false perspective, and who, very consistently, completely reject the entire doctrine of economic determinism and class struggle. Second group, the so-called Stalinist communists, who claim to accept Marxist historical and economic doctrines even though putting forward demands in the advanced capitalist countries too, which are not revolutionary but identical to, if not worse than, the politics, democracy, and economics, popular progressivism of the traditional reformists. Third group, the professed followers of the revolutionary doctrine and method who, however, attribute its present abandonment by the proletarian majority to initial defects and deficiencies in the theory, which needs therefore to be corrected and updated. Negators, falsifiers, modernizers. We fight all three, but today consider the modernizers to be the worst. 3. The history of the Marxist left, of radical Marxism, or more precisely, of Marxism, consists of a series of battles against each of the revisionist waves, which have attacked various aspects of its doctrine and method, setting out from the organic monolithic formation which roughly corresponds to the 1848 Manifesto. Everywhere else we have covered the history of these struggles inside the three historic internationals, fought against utopians, workerists, libertarians, reformists, and gradualist social democrats, syndicalists of the left and right, social patriots, and today against national communists and populist communists. This struggle in all its phases spanning 4 generations is a heritage not of a few big names, but of a well-defined, compact school, in the historical sense of a well-defined party. 4. This long and difficult struggle would lose its connection with the recovery to come if, rather than drawing the lesson of invariance from it, we accepted the banal idea that Marxism is a theory in, quote, continuous historical elaboration, end quote, which needs to adapt and draw lessons from changing circumstances. Invariably, such is the justification used to excuse all the betrayals of which there has been such abundant evidence in every revolutionary defeat. All right. So really, I do hope that they go into greater detail about this, but I'm just going to say straight out that dialectical materialism necessarily is a continuous historical development. Historical materialism is definitionally something that is in constant motion and constantly developing. To reject this is revisionism of the worst sort. So unless they are very clear about this, for example, I would consider class struggle very specifically to be invariant because class struggle is history itself. Rejection of history itself is revisionist. Rejection of the motive force of history is revisionist. And therefore, rejection of class struggle is revisionist. However, that does not mean that Marxist theory is brought to an end. Rosa Luxemburg has a wonderful piece on this. And essentially, she talks about how through action and through putting principles into action, we learn. And at any point that the theoretical development stalls, that's because action is not being taken. Now, in the previous reading of this stuff, they talked about how they would not do any development of theory because they had lost their links to the masses and they couldn't put their tactics into praxis in order to develop it. And so they would only look at the past and learn from that. This seems to be a development of that, and we'll see if it is a correct one in that they are simply restating the need to keep to things like class struggle and the need for centralization of the party, or if they're going to be going in from a dogmatist path, and the application of one set of tactics and whatnot to different conditions. We'll see. Continuing. 5. The materialist rejection of the idea that a theoretical system which arose at such and such a moment, or worse still, arose in the mind and was systematized within the work of a given man, thinker, or historical leader, or any of those things combined, can encompass the entire course of future history, its laws and principles, in an irrevocable way, shouldn't be understood as a rejection of the notion that systems of principle can be stable over extremely long periods of time. In fact, their stability and resistance to attack and to being, quote, improved as well means that they constitute a major weapon in the armory of the social class to which they belong and whose historical tasks and interests they reflect. The succession of such systems and bodies of doctrine and praxis is tied not to the advent of outstanding man, but rather to the succession of modes of production, as to types of material organizing of the living human collectivity. 6. Although obviously having recognized the formal content of the bodies of doctrine of all the great historical eras is wrong, dialectical materialism does not deny that they were necessary for their time, much less does it imagine that error could have been avoided by improved thinking on the part of the sages and legislators, or that their errors could have been spotted earlier and corrections made. The reason and explanation for every system is contained within its life cycle, the most significant ones being those which have remained most unchanging organically over the course of a long period of struggle. I wanted to add this to the communist mode production reading. Quick. Continuing. 7. According to Marxism, historical progress in the realm, above all, of the organization of productive resources is not continual and gradual, but is rather a series of consecutive, widely spaced leaps forward which cause profound disruption in the entire socio-economic apparatus, shaking it to its very foundations. These are genuine cataclysms, disasters, rapid crises, in which everything changes very quickly after having stayed the same for a very long period of time, as with the physical world, with the stars and the cosmos, with geology, and with the phylogenesis of living organisms themselves. 8. Since class ideology is a superstructure of the modes of production, it is not shaped by the daily flow of particles of knowledge either, but appears within the chasm produced by a violent clash, and it guides the class whose expression it is, in a substantially monolithic and stable form, through a long series of struggles and convulsions until the next critical phase is reached, until the next historical revolution. 9. It was actually the doctrines of capitalism, after having excused all past social revolutions up to the bourgeois one, which would declare that history would from that point proceed along a slowly ascending path, with no further social catastrophes, inasmuch as ideological systems would thenceforth gradually absorb the flow of new conquests made in the realm of pure and applied knowledge. Marxism has shown the fallaciousness of such a vision of the future. 10. Marxism itself isn't a doctrine which can be molded and remolded each day by adding and changing bits of it, patching it up more like. Because it is still counted amongst those doctrines, even if a foul one, which function as a weapon of a dominated and exploited class which needs to overturn social relations, and the process of which is subjected in 1,001 ways to conservative influences of the traditional forms of ideologies of the enemy classes. Okay, so essentially what it's saying is that you can only develop ideologies really through physical experience. So you're going in and applying them through praxis, right? And there's no point in developing them purely in the mind, especially because the his because your society, the antibodies I talked about, how society builds up antibodies against threats against it. In this case, the capitalist society develops antibodies against proletarian class struggle in all sorts of forms, but especially within the intellectual realm with intellectual counter-revolution. And therefore, it seems to be saying that essentially any development to theory under these circumstances can only lead to it diverging more with reality and essentially, how do I put this? And essentially making it more in line with current times in a bad way. I don't agree with this. It just let's put that out there. I agree that all things need to be put into practical action in order to determine their veracity. However, let us say, for example, that I have devised a way to give evidence that surplus value is, in fact, being extracted. Marx doesn't actually have any such evidence for this. It would be very useful, though, to produce it. Right. So, is this a development? Yes, it is. Or consider, for example, I was just talking about this earlier today. The Rainbow Coalition by the Black Panther Party. This is a new tactic, a new process, and whatnot. This is devised through experiences and through theoretical development. They recognize their needs, and then they said, "Okay, how do we do them?" And they went forward with it, and it worked. I don't agree with the idea that, oh, because bourgeois counter-revolution within ideology is focused on us, that means that we can't continue development because it'll only make our movement less pure or something. I think that's profoundly reaction. I don't know what the point there is. You're just screwing yourself in the long term. Anyway, continuing. 11. Although it's now possible, or rather it was possible from when the proletariat first appeared on the great historical stage, to catch a glimpse of a future society without classes and therefore without revolutions, it must be stated that the revolutionary class in the long period leading up to that time will only have completed its task insofar as pressed forward using a doctrine and methodology which has remained stable, and which has been fixed in a monolithic program for the duration of the terrible struggle, with the number of followers and successfulness of particular phases and particular social battles, remaining all the while extremely variable. 12. Although, therefore, the ideological endowment of the revolutionary working class is no longer revelation, myth and idealism as it was for previous classes, but positive science instead. It nevertheless still needs a stable formulation of its principles and rules of action, which fulfill the purpose and have the same decisive efficacy as the dogmas, catechisms, tables, constitutions, and the books of guidance, such as the Vedas, the Talmud, the Bible, the Quran, and the Bill of Rights had in the past. The profound errors of form and substance contained in these books did not detract from, indeed, in many cases, they contributed to their enormous organizational and social force, which is first revolutionary, then counter-revolutionary, in a dialectical succession. 13. The same way that Marxism excludes any kind of search for absolute truth by seeking doctrine not as an evidence of timeless spirit or abstract reason, but as an instrument of work and as a weapon of combat. It postulates that when exerting yourself to the utmost and in a pitched battle, you don't send your tools or your weapons off for repair, or rather, in order to win in both peace and war, you need from the beginning the right equipment and weapons to brandish at the enemy. A new doctrine cannot appear at just any historical moment. They are given very characteristic and also very rare periods of history when, like a dazzling beam in the middle of light, one can appear, and if the crucial moment is not recognized and the terrible light is not faced, it is no good resorting to little candles instead, by which the way is lit for academic pedants and fighters of little faith. Okay, this is completely incorrect. Completely and utterly incorrect. And I'm talking purely about this question of sending your weapons off to repair. People don't fight in wars on battlefields unceasingly. You get into short combats, and then you have reserves go and support you, and you send your equipment back in for maintenance, for refilling, and whatnot. And when your weapons don't fit the situation, then you call somebody else in and have them come in and deal with it for you. Infantry doesn't fight naval battles, right? With that aside, no, I don't agree with this at all. I I do agree that it's important to have some sort of core principles. You go and say, here are our principles. We've got them written down. They're dynamic and wide open, but they're going to be unchanging for the time being. If they're talking about that in terms of invariance, then absolutely I agree. You got your bill, you got your constitution in place. Whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. You've got your principles in place, and you're like, these will not change unless very specific things occur. If that's what they're talking about, and it seems like they are, that's fine. But then it's kind of like, oh, yeah, you don't change out your weapons according to changes in the battle. It's like, no. You come with many, many, many different weapons and many, many different people, and you have your reserve swap according to what's necessary, because people need to rest. They need to go back home. They need to back home. They need to go to the back lines. They get their weapons turned in and looked over by the quartermaster, who then gives them back after making sure they're in working order, and restocking and refilling munitions and whatnot. And it doesn't really go over, at least I don't think, what a new doctrine looks like. New doctrine can appear at just any historical moment. And then it's like, oh yes, dazzling beam of light. So I suppose what they mean here is that a slogan comes in and it becomes super successful. Like all power to the Soviets. We're gonna do this, and then we're gonna break this down. All right. So we should have some form of solid and clear fundamental principles which do not change generally. Such will produce organizational and social force. Though its conditions which produce such principles change, they take on a conservative and thereby counter-revolutionary form. Any new principles or doctrines will only appear under revolutionary circumstances with powerful slogans such as power to Soviets. And that's my own translation there. Continuing. 15. For the modern proletarian class, which arose in those countries where the great capitalist industrial development first got underway, the darkness was pierced shortly before the middle of the 19th century. From then on, the integral doctrine which we believe in, which we must and want to believe in, would contain all the necessary data to shape and describe the long course, stretching over centuries, which it will need to be which will be needed to verify it and reaffirm it after countless struggles. Either this position remains valid, or the doctrine will have shown itself to be false, and the announced appearance of the new class with its own character, program, and revolutionary function in history will have been in vain. Whoever therefore sets out to change parts of the Marxist, quote, corpus, its theses and essential articles which have been in our possession for around a century now, saps its strength far more than he who renounces it in full and declares it aborted. No, that's not how that works. Let's talk about the difference between. Let's talk about science for a second here. When did, for example, minute changes to the heliocentric model harm the heliocentric model more or less? Or sorry, the wait, what's the Earth as the center of the universe? Uh, Earth as center. Geocentric model. Was the geocentric model hurt more by minute changes in the theory of geocentricity, or was it hurt more by the development of the heliocentric model? I think that we can historically say which was more harmed, and it's not the first one. And science is like this, right? The example I have heard in the past is about Jupiter, right? Classical Newtonian physics, we could not see Jupiter, but we assumed that would be there. Actually, one second. Right. I need to point out that proper scientific method of falsification is different from Popper's, as he fails to differentiate between supplementary hypothesis that adds clauses to the theory and unaccounted factor, which explains discrepancy between predicted and observed specific case. For example, when Kepler's law did not work for Uranus, making hypotheses that there was another planet, today known as Neptune, was not unscientific. Theory was not amended. On the other hand, claiming that Kepler's laws do not apply to Uranus would have been. Okay, this is fair. Okay. Right. The theory is not amended, if that's what they're going for. Rather, we say, hey, there's something that we don't know and that we'll find it out later. This is fair if this is what it's going for. Though, of course, sometimes the theory does need to be amended because it, like geocentrism, it might just be wrong, which I think that on second thought, it does talk about. The doctrine will have shown itself to be false. Yeah, okay. No, this is fair. This is fair. I was too tough on the text and wasn't reading correctly. Okay, so theory does not need to be amended unless it is shown to be entirely false. Under circumstances we expect to see something but do not, we can make a hypothesis about until we come to prove through experience. Those trying to claim that theory applies in one area but not another, for example, patriotic socialists in our current period, are more threat than those who reject class struggle altogether. Back to the text. 19, or excuse me, 16. After the explosive period, in which the very novelty of the new rendification gave it a clear and sharply delineated form, there followed, due to the worsening situation, a period which may be, and in fact is, characterized by an equilibrium in which we have not enhancement and development, but rather involution and degeneration of so-called class consciousness. The moments when class struggle becomes accentuated are, as the entire history of Marxism proves, the moments when the theory comes back to glorious affirmations of its origins and of the first integral expression. Suffice to recall the Paris Commune, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the first post-World War period in the West. 17. The principle of the historical invariance of doctrines which reflect the tasks of protagonist classes, and also the potent referring back to founding principles, stands opposed to the gossipy assumption that every generation and every season of intellectual fashion is more powerful than the previous one. It rejects the whole silly film show which portrayed a relentless advance of civil progress and other such bourgeois prejudices from which the very few of those who claim to the objective Marxists are really free. It is a principle which applies to every great historical period. 18. All myths are an expression of this, above all the ones about demigods or sages who had an audience of the Supreme Being. Laughing at such imaginings is stupid, and Marxism alone has discovered the real and material substructure underlying them. Rama, Moses, Christ, Muhammad, all the prophets and heroes who initiate centuries of history for the various peoples, all are diverse expressions of this real fact, which corresponds to the enormous leap in the mode of production. In the pagan myth, wisdom, that is, Minerva, emerges from the brain of Jupiter not by the dictation to flabby scribes of entire volumes, but because of the hammerings of the worker god Vulcan, who have been called on to alleviate an uncontrollable migraine. Okay, this is a really weird, uh, it is really weird as a, uh, example. At the other end of the historical spectrum, faced with the illuminist doctrine of the new goddess reason, I'm guessing that they are talking about the French Revolution, which wanted to abandon Christianity at one point in exchange for a goddess of reason and science, which is an interesting bit of history. Also, something similar happened in the Russian Revolution as well, in a certain area. Continuing. At the other end of the historical spectrum, faced with the illuminist doctrine of the new goddess reason, there arises a giant figure of Gracchus Babeuf, who, rough and ready in his theoretical presentation, tells us that physical material forces impel us far more than reason and knowledge. So I'm not. I can tell you right now that Moses was not, and Christ for that matter, weren't really associated with changing in uh, the mode of production. I can't tell you about Rama, and I don't think that was the case with Muhammad either. Muhammad was like a empire builder. Yeah, these are out of place examples. I don't agree. I don't disagree on the face of it in what they're getting at. They're talking about how essentially these things catch on and became homestays in human society because they came at very important points in history. You know, men make their own history, but they don't make it as they please under self-selected conditions and all of that. But I don't think that you can say these prophets and whatnot, you know, were corresponded to within or sleep in the mode of production. at all. Especially when we're talking about Greek stuff right here. Because the Greek mode of production was slave society, state, nation states the entire way through, or say states the entire way through, from start to finish. So these examples don't really work. Anyway, though. 19. There's no lack of examples of restores of in the face of revisionist generations, as Francis was with respect to Christ when Christianity, arisen to redeem the meek, made itself comfortable in the courts of the medieval Signory. Okay, sure. So were the Gracchi with respect to Lucius Junius Brutus, and so many times the standard bearers of an up-and-coming class had to be with respect to revolutionary renegades from the heroic phase of previous classes. Struggles in France, 1831, 1848, 1849, and innumerable other phases throughout Europe. 20. We take the position that all the great events of recent times are just so many clear cuts and conclusive confirmations of Marxism's theories and predictions. This we relate above all to those controversial points which have provoked, once again, major defections on class terrain and embarrassed even those who deem Stalinist position to be completely opportunist. These points are the advent of totalitarian and centralized capitalist forms in the economic as well as the political field, the managed economy, state capitalism, the open bourgeois dictatorships, and for its part, the process of Russian and Asian social and political development. We can thus see confirmed not only our doctrine, but that this doctrine was born in monolithic form at a crucial time. I don't actually understand this conclusion. 1 second. All right, so what I think it's saying here is essentially that um, the doctrine that they have developed, the doctrine that they have was developed through explosive changes in the past and revolutionary events. And then what has ended up happening, and then shoot. Um so their doctrine developed through major shifts in society. That is, for example, the Bolshevik Revolution, through practical action, and essentially what they see now is the development of various alternative forms of capitalism in response to the class struggle. Um, and there are all sorts of people who are advocating the change of the form of the class struggle in response to this, when it shouldn't be the case. Rather, the class struggle itself and Marxist theories and predictions have been proved through the need of these various capitalist countries to take on these different forms: managed economy, state capitalism, open bourgeois dictatorships, and so on and so forth. Therefore, anybody trying to push for a different form of class struggle is only harming one's ability to take action. All right, so the class struggle and Marxism theories and predictions developed during periods of intense historical changes are validated through the changes in the form of capitalism in response to the class struggle. Those seeking to change the form of the class struggle in response are harming the assault on bourgeois society and the development of history and Marxism. Okay, continuing. 21. Whoever succeeds in pitting the historical events of this volcanic period against Marxist theory will have proved it wrong. We will have completely defeated it, along with all attempts to deduce the main features of historical progress from economic relationships. And not only that, he would have successfully proved that in every phase, new events require new deductions, new explanations, and new theories, and consequently would have proved the viability of a new, different means of action. Essentially, this is establishing the falsifiability of Marxism and therefore the scientific character of it. If something like the class struggle could be disproven through practice, which we have carried out in the past, then you could say, okay, then you need to abandon your theory and adopt another one. And then they would have to prove what the actual um, historical trajectory is, and that's another thing entirely. But essentially, they're saying no, that's not happened, and our theory has worked in practical action. We have proof because we've had these various events in the past. Since this is scientific, you cannot simply just toss away the theory or go in and say this theory applies in some places but not in others. Just like we can't we can't say, oh, Uranus is, special and doesn't obey Kepler's law. Instead, we say, no, there must be a planet that we can't see just yet, and then develop tools in order to find it, right? Continuing. 22. One illusory way out of current difficulty is to allow that the basic theory should remain subject to changes, that today is actually the very day to write a new chapter of said theory. Such an act of being thought capable of turning the unfavorable situation around. And it really is an aberration when such a task is taken on by small groups of laughable strength, or worse still, when the quote new thinking emerges from some free discussion which, Lilliput like, mimics bourgeois parliamentarism and its famous clash of individual opinions, which isn't the latest, most up to date resource, but just ancient foolishness. 23. At present, we are at the lowest point of the curve of revolutionary potential, and therefore centuries away from the next of these moments which will be conducive to the appearance of a new historical theory. I really hope it's not centuries, because we don't have centuries, we have climate change. In the present situation, with no imminent prospect of a great social upheaval, it is not just a political disintegration of the global proletarian class which is the logical result. Just as logical is the existence of small groups that know how to maintain the guiding historical thread of their great revolutionary course, stretched like a great arc between two social revolutions, on condition that these groups show no desire to spread original ideas and remain strictly attached to traditional formulations of Marxism. 24. Criticism, doubt, and questioning of all the old entrenched positions was a decisive feature of the great modern bourgeois revolution, whose gigantic shockwaves would overwhelm the natural sciences, the social order, and the political and military powers, and then go on in much less iconoclastic leaps to come up with the sciences of human society and of historical progress. All this was a fact of an epoch of profound turmoil which straddled the feudal and landed Middle Ages, industrial and capitalist modernity. The critique was the effect and not the driving force of this immense and complex struggle. 25. Doubt and examination of individual consciousness and expressions of the bourgeois reformation and compact tradition and authority of the Christian Church, once transformed into the most hypocritical Puritanism and under the banner of bourgeois conformity to religious morality or to individual rights. They would launch and protect the new class domination and the new form of subjection of the masses. The proletarian revolution takes the opposite path. Individual consciousness is nothing, and concordant direction to collective action is everything. We're going to take this, and we're also going to take this for that last bit. Okay, so the social critique and the development of theory of history and society was the result of class struggle and historic shifts. The theory came after the action. Such development occurs as a result of societal struggle. Individuals developing theory are unable to reach the masses who carry it out without conditions for them picking it up. The proletarian revolution understands that individual consciousness is unable to carry out historical change. Rather, concordant, harmonious direction of collective action is. Okay. 26. When the famous Theses on Feuerbach, Marx said the philosophers had done enough interpreting of the world and the time had come to change it. He did not mean to say that willingly that willing change conditions the change itself. There, there's some sort of translation error, I assume. But that change, determined by the clash of collective forces, comes first, and only then critical consciousness of it by individual subjects. Indeed, the latter don't act on the basis of decisions which each has developed separately, but on the basis of influences which precede science and precede consciousness. And passing from the weapon of criticism to the criticism of weapons, one actually transfers everything from the thinking subject to the militant mass in such a way that not only rifles and cannons serve as weapons, but, above all, that real instrument which is the common, uniform, monolithic, and steadfast doctrine of the party to which we are all subordinated and bound, bringing gossipy and know-it-all discussion to an end. Okay. The false resource of activism. 1. A current but unoriginal objection, considering it has already been used to justify the worst episodes of the movement's degeneration, devalues clarity and continuity of principles and incites us to, quote, be political, and immerse ourselves in the activity of the movement, which will show us the road to follow. Don't stop and make a decision on the basis of a thorough evaluation of texts and weighing up of previous experiences, but press forward nonstop into the action of life. Or life of action, rather. 2. This practicalism is a distortion of Marxism, whether highlighting the resolution and vigor of leaders and vanguard groups at the expense of doctrinal scruples, or when referring back to some, quote, class decision, or consultation of the majority with an air of having chosen the path of the most of the workers, impelled by their economic interests preferred. These are old tricks, and no trader who sold out to the dominant class ever departed without claiming, firstly, that he was the best and the most active, practical proponent of the workers' interests, and secondly, that what he did was due to the manifest will of the mass of his followers, or electors. 3. The revisionist deviations, such as Bernstein's evolutionist, reformist, and egalitarian deviation, was actually profoundly activist rather than ultra-determinist. It wasn't a case of replacing the far too ambitious revolutionary goal with the little of the situation allowing the workers to attain, but of closing one's eyes to the dazzling vision of the historical arc saying, getting results now is all. Let us set ourselves lower targets and aim rather at immediate goals which are local and transitory rather than universal, and then it may be possible to get results thanks to our willpower. Pro-violent syndicalists such as Sorel would say much the same, and end up doing the same. The former aspiring more to wringing legislative measures from Parliament, the latter to victories in the workplace and within the trade, both of them turning their backs on historical tasks. All right. So I do want to be clear here. At no point have they said outright not to engage in immediate individual struggles. It's just that the party needs to be doing this on the party line, and this is important because essentially, how do I put this? They're talking about a particular way of engaging, action for action's sake, activity for activity's sake, rather with some larger goal in mind. Uh, Rosa Luxemburg would call this opportunism in this case because they don't have the final goal in mind. Or maybe they do. It's just that their actions aren't really engaged in developing that. They're completely embroiled in the now moment, the active moment. Now, I don't think there's too many people like this. I might be wrong. I couldn't really imagine engaging in struggle on these ends, but I'm sure that there are people who enjoy this sort of stuff and do that. Um, but I don't know if I would call this anything but adventurism personally. I've thrown out words like opportunist and stuff, but now I'm like, wait, no, this is adventurism, isn't it? Because it's not done with the party. Anyway, just understand that they're not saying don't get involved with active movements. They're just saying be mindful of the way you involve yourself. Continuing. Four, all of these, 100 and other one and 101 other types of eclecticism, quote unquote, which have claimed the right to change fronts and indeed entire doctrines, started with a falsification. That such a continual adjusting of one's aims and changing of direction can be found in the writings of Marx and Engels. In all our work, with the use of copious in-depth studies and quotations, we demonstrate the continuity of the line, and we have illustrated by referencing passages and fundamental theories from the very earliest texts, which use the same words and drew the same conclusions. 5. So the myth of Marx's two consecutive souls, the young and the old, is very shallow. The former, supposedly idealist, voluntarist, and Hegelian, and under the influence of the last tremors of the bourgeois revolutions, extremists and insurrectionists. The latter, allegedly a cold scholar of contemporary economic phenomena who is positive, evolutionist, and egalitarian. This is this this breaking of young and old Marx comes principally from Althusser, to my knowledge. Um, and this is a matter of scholarly debate. I personally take the position that there was no such break. I think that maybe he focused on different things differently. I think that that would be a fair thing to say, but I don't think that you can make a break between the two. You can't say, oh no, Marx gave up his theory of alienation, or Marx gave up his humanism. No, absolutely not. The theory of alienation, for example, is embedded wholly and utterly within his later works. Continuing. On the contrary, it is the repeated deviations in the long sequence we have explained so often, be the extremist or moderate and the banal exception, which, unable to cope with the revolutionary tension of dialectical materialism, have relapsed into analogous bourgeois deviation, which is idealist, individualist, and pro-consciousness. They're probably talking about the situationists right now. Were the situationists international? Situationist International. Was that around at this time? 1957. Okay, so it wasn't developed yet, but I assume that the seeds for it were developing. So that's probably what they're critiquing, this developing trend towards the situationists. And the situationists were essentially this group that said, okay, you got the Society of the Spectacle and all that, not that they had that term yet. Um, and essentially, we need to get people outside of themselves. So we need to create situations which break with bourgeois society. And this is done with intense arts, displays, détournement, all sorts of tactics in order to kind of draw individual consciousness out of capitalist ways of thinking. Okay, uh, continuing. All it is just idle gossip about irrelevant details, passivity. In fact, total revolutionary impotence on a historic scale. 6. Suffice to recall that at the end of the first volume of Capital, in which the expropriation of the expropriators is described in a footnote, the corresponding passage of the Manifesto is just repeated. The economic theories of the second and third volumes are just developments off the main trunk of the theory of value and surplus value set out in the first, and utilizing the same terms, formulae, and even symbols. And all Antonio Graziade's attempts to undermine this unity will be in vain. The separation of the analytical descriptive part of capitalism from the programmatic part is fiction as well. I'll read this word. Degenerates have always proved incapable of grasping the power of Marx's critique of utopianism, the democracy for that matter. It isn't a matter of dreaming up some aim and feeling one has done one's bit by dreaming about it, or that the dream's heroic hue will inspire people to make a reality. Rather, it is a matter of discovering the goal to be physically reached and heading directly towards it, knowing that human blindness and ignorance will not stop it from being achieved. Uh, we'll add this, but I'm not going to summarize it currently. But basically, the important bits in this are, hey, look, the key things are, the theory of value and surplus value. And in addition, you can't just dream about it and think about it. The point isn't just to think about the world, it's to change it. La da da, all that good stuff, right? Take what you thought up and then put it to action, test it, see if it works, and if it does, then carry it out. Because if it does work, then you're right. Anyway, 7. What is certain that is that Marx had established a link, already perceived by the best utopian socialists, between this distant achievement and the actual physical movement of a social class already in struggle, the modern proletariat. But it is not enough just to comprehend the dynamic of the class revolution as a whole. If one wants to know the overall construction of Marx's work, a work he was unable to complete, you can see that he still hasn't given his final word about the impersonal nature and activity of the class, even though he did think and write about it, it was very clear. Within such a treatise, the finishing touches are put to the entire economic and social construction, in the only way which is consistent with the method which allowed it to be established in the first place. 8. It isn't enough for Marxist determinism to reject the idea that the quality and activity of men of exceptional value in the realm of thought and practical struggle is a motor cause. Motor cause, as ever, not to be confused with operating agent of historical events, and to put class, understood as a statistical group of individuals, in its place. That would simply be shifting the ideal factors of consciousness and collectivity from the individual to the multitude. It would just be an exchanging of aristocratic philosophy for a demo-populist one, the latter farther from us than the former. It's a matter of reversing the location of cause, taking out of the realm of ideas and into the physical, material world of events. I don't know what they mean that they are closer to aristocratic philosophy than the demo-populist one. And I would like them to elaborate on that. Of course, they won't. But I think that if you find yourself closer to an aristocratic philosophy, then you're having a problem. I'm just going to put that way. Yeah, it's not about, okay, individual smart people come to conclusions, or a lot of people agree with you, therefore you're right. It's a matter of reversing the location of cause, taking out of the realm of ideas and into the physical material world of events. 9. The Marxist thesis states, it isn't possible, first of all, for consciousness of the historical road to appear in advance within a single human brain. This is for 2 reasons. Firstly, consciousness follows rather than precedes, being, that is, the material conditions which surround the subject of consciousness itself. Secondly, all forms of social consciousness, with a given delay allowing them time to get generally established, emerge out of circumstances which are analogous and parallel to the economic relations in which the masses of individuals find themselves, thereby forming a social class. Historically, the latter are then led to act together long before they can think together. The theory of this relationship between class conditions and class actions and its future point of arrival isn't required of persons, in the sense that it isn't required of a particular author or leader, nor is it asked of, quote, the class as a whole, in the sense of a fleeting sum of individuals in existence at a certain time or place, and much less can it be deduced from an extremely bourgeois consultation, quote unquote, of the class. Okay? We'll add that. Alright, so consciousness follows material conditions surrounding that consciousness. All forms of social consciousness emerge from circumstances involved with economic relations. This produces a social class. No single individual can provide a full analysis of the whole of the class in their consciousness. The class as a whole cannot simply be consulted to determine their theory and consciousness. Theory and consciousness arise out of material conditions. Um, and, and basically, therefore, you have a class consciousness. An individual only has class consciousness insofar as they are part of the social class in a material act of struggle. Okay, 10. For us, a proletarian dictatorship isn't a consultative democracy imported up into the proletariat, but an organized historic force which at a given moment, followed by a part of the proletariat, not even a majority, expresses the material pressure which brings down the old mode of bourgeois production, opening the way to the new communist one. Another important factor, always given due emphasis by Marx, is that of deserters from the dominant class who pass over to revolutionary camp, offsetting the action of the huge masses of proletarians who serve and are in material and mental bondage to the bourgeoisie, and who, in a statistical sense, almost always form the majority. I'll add this to our reading from the Time Smoke production. Okay. 11. There's nothing about the Russian Revolution which has led our current to ascribe its negative outcome to having violated internal class democracy, or to make us think twice about the Marxist and Leninist theory of the dictatorship, whose final judge and shaper won't be a constitution or organizational formulae, but the historical relations of forces alone. The complete abandonment of the terrain of class dictatorship is instead revealed by Stalinism's complete inversion of the revolutionary method. No less than all the others, the ex-communists, whenever they move on to the democratic terrain, place themselves in the realm of popular and national democracy. In Russia, no less than outside it, their entire policy is one of abandoning class aims for national aims. Even if we adopt the most simplistic description of this policy as the state's espionage network abroad, those who attempt to take the democratic road are embarking on the road to capitalism, and that includes the wishy-washy anti-Stalinists who shout about suppressed proletarian opinions in Russia. Countless Marx quotations could be used to show this impersonal aspect of historic events, without which the theory of the latter's materiality would be inadmissible. We know that only the first volume of his great work, Capital, was completed by Marx. In his letters and prefaces, Engels would recall how difficult it was to set the second and third volumes in order. The fourth, A History of Rival Economic Doctrines, was easier. Engels is even unsure about the correct sequence of the chapters and sections of the two books, which represent a study of the overall process of capitalism in its various forms. Not in order to describe the capitalism of Marx's day, but to show that, whatever happens, the general tendency of the process is not towards equilibrium and a, quote, regiment state, like a perennial and constant river without drought and without flooding, but towards a series of ever-deepening crises and towards a revolutionary collapse of the general form under investigation. 13. In his 1859 preface to the Critique of Political Economy, the first draft of Capital, Marx, after having dealt with the three classes of modern society, landowners, capitalists, and proletarians, tells us he intended to cover three other topics: state, international trade, and world market. We find the state covered in the Paris Commune text of 1871 and the classic chapters by Engels, and indeed in State and Revolution. International commerce is covered in Lenin's imperialism. It is a historical school we are dealing with, not the opera omnia of one particular individual. The theme of the, quote, world market is a date inscribed in flaming letters in a book of current events, which no one knows how to interpret and which a dying Stalin briefly touched on with his feeble theory of the double market. And if only all the various researchers weren't so prone to thinking in terms of peoples and countries, and those the bankrupt ideologies of the bourgeois age: peace, liberty, independence, sanctity of the person, and constitutionality of electoral decisions. They would find a spark which will ignite the world capitalist conflagration of the second half of this century. How? Explain how. What? I don't know how to read this. Okay, whatever. 14. After having dealt with the way in which the social product gets divided up amongst the three main classes, forming their economic revenue, less precisely income, rent, profit, and wages, after having shown the handing the first step over to the state wouldn't change the capitalist order, and that not even handing over the entire surplus value to the state would overstep the limits of form of production, insofar as there'd still be the same squandering of living labor, that is to say, the high expenditure of time and effort, as under the enterprising commercial forward system. Marx concludes the strictly economic part, thus, quote, what characterizes the capitalist mode of production is the production of surplus value as a direct aim and determining motive of production. Capital produces essentially capital, and does so only to the extent that it produces surplus value. Communism will only produce surplus value which isn't capital. It'll produce surplus product, not surplus value. Continuing. But the cause isn't to be found in the existence of capitalists or indeed of the capitalist class, for these are not only just effects, but unnecessary effects at that. Quote, whereas on the basis of capitalist production, the mass of direct producers is confronted by the social character of their production in the form of strictly regulating authority and the social mechanism of the labor process organized as a complete hierarchy, example, bureaucratic. This authority reaches its bearers, however, only as a personification of the conditions of labor in contrast to labor, and not as political or theocratic leaders as under the earlier modes of production. Among the bearers of this authority, the capitalists themselves, there reigns a most complete anarchy within the social interrelations of production assert themselves only as an overwhelming natural law in relation to individual free will. End quote. Keeping to the formidable invariance of the original text is therefore all that is required to link the would-be updaters to the murky and most slipshod of bourgeois prejudices, which seeks to blame every social inferiority either on the individual will or at most the collective responsibility of a social class, whereas it was entirely clear from then on whether it was the individual capitalist or the capitalist class which might be there and might cease to be the personification of capital. That capital itself would continue facing us, confronting us as a social mechanism, as an overwhelming natural law of the production process. I'm going to add this to economy of soil production. Continuing. 15. The latter is from the most formidable concluding chapter of Capital, chapter 51, volume 3, which completes the description of the present economy but also evokes the specter of revolution on every page. Chapter 52, which follows, is a little more than a page long, is the one in which a tired Engels writes under the final incomplete line in parentheses, quote, here the manuscript breaks off. Ouch. that's really sad. Yeah. Title: The Classes. We are on the threshold of the rovescimento della prassi, the reversal praxis. And having ruled out individual will, we are able to move on to discover the agent of the revolution. First and foremost, the chapter says we have set out the laws for capitalist society in its pure form, with the said three classes, but this doesn't exist even in England, and doesn't in 1953 either, over there or elsewhere, nor will it ever exist, just like the two material points endowed with mass to which Newton's law reduces the cosmos. Quote, but the question to be answered is this: what constitutes a class? Quote, at first glance, the identity of revenues and the sources of revenue. Quote, however, from this standpoint, physicians and officials, as an example, would constitute two classes, for to belong to two distinct social groups, the members of each of these groups receiving their revenue from one and the same source. The same would be true for the infinite fragmentation of interest and rank into which the division of social labor sets the laborers as well as the capitalists and landlords. The latter, for example, into owners of vineyards, farm owners, owners of forests, mine owners, and owners of fisheries, etc. The thought and the sentence breaks off here, but it is enough. 16. Without demanding royalties for just the one line, we can complete the chapter which is interrupted by the death of Karl Marx, which he would consider an arbitrary individual incident, and who is accustomed to quote Epicurus on such occasions, philosopher to whom the young postgraduate had dedicated his thesis. As relayed by Engels, quote, every event which derives from necessity carries in itself its own consolation, end quote. It is pointless to have regrets. It isn't identifying sources of revenue as it appears at first glance, which defines a class. With one blow, syndicalism, workerism, laborism, corporatism, Masonism, and Christian socialism are knocked off their pedestals all once and for all, including all past versions and those yet to come. But our conquest went well beyond getting the ideologues of the spirit and the individual, of the liberal society and the constitutional state, to recognize in a half-hearted way that different professions and trades have collective interests which cannot be ignored. More than anything, our initial victory lay in establishing that, with regard to the quote, social question, even in such a reduced form, it was useless to stick one's nose in the air and close one's eyes to it. It would penetrate the modern world. But spreading through it in a capillary fashion is one thing, is quite another to smash it to smithereens. It is worthless, statistically, to define classes in a, quote, qualitative way according to a monetary source of income. It is even stupider to select them in a quantitative way according to the, quote, pyramid of earnings. For centuries this has been raised. In fact, the state census in Rome is all about income scales. For centuries, simple arithmetic operations have shown to the philosophers of poverty that reducing the pyramid to a more level prism on the same foundations will just create a society of paupers. Is there, qualitatively and quantitatively, a way out of these myriad difficulties? A senior civil servant is paid a salary, and therefore according to time, just like a wage earner laborer who works, let's say, in a state salt works. However, the former's income is higher than many merchants and industrial capitalists who live off of profit. The laborer's salary is higher not only than many small peasants' income, but also more than that of many minor landlords giving off rent. A class isn't defined by income standards, but by historical position within the gigantic struggle by which a new general form of production overtakes, overthrows, and replaces the old one. We'll add this. It is stupid to consider society as simply made up of the sum of its individuals understood in an abstract sense, but it is no less stupid to see class as simply made up of individuals understood as economic units. Individual, class, and society are not pure idealist categories. Since they are constantly altering within time and space, they are products of a general process, whose sovereign laws have been worked out by applying the powerful methods of the Marxist approach. The concrete social mechanisms propels and molds individuals, classes, and societies without, quote, consulting them on any level. A class is defined by its historic task and the road it takes, and our class by an arduous dialectical point of arrival to be reached only after immense effort, is defined by the vindication that the class itself should actually cease to exist in a statistical, quantitative, and qualitative sense, a demand made particularly in regard to itself, since it has little or no interest in advocating the disappearance of its enemy classes, a process well underway already. Today, the class as a whole appears before us in a state of constant flux, as nowadays it is for Stalin, for capitalist states such as Russia, for a gang of MPs and would-be MPs who are much more anti-Marxist than Turati, Bisolati, Languet, and Millerand ever were. So I'm going to take this and we're going to put that in. I'm not going to summarize this right now. Or actually, no, I will. All right. A class is a historic position in the class struggle for a new form of production, the negation of a negation. The class is constantly altering in time and space, a product of a general process within the mode of production. Through understanding the laws of motion of a given mode of production, we can scientifically understand the class content of a given society. As such, we do not need to consult individuals about their experiences to understand their societal role. The proletariat's dialectical role is its own destruction in a statistical, quantitative, and qualitative sense, the full negation of class society. Therefore, all that remains is the party as the existing organ which defines class, struggles for the class, and when the time comes to govern for the class and prepares for a time when there will be no governments and no classes. On condition, that is, that the party doesn't belong to particular men, doesn't succumb to the cult of the leader. That goes back to defending, with blind faith if necessary, its invariable theory and rigid organization, and a method which doesn't set out from sectarian preconceptions, but knows that a society which has developed into its into its typical form, like Israel in year 0 and Europe in year 1900. One has a strictly applied battle cry. Those who aren't with us are against us. So the party, as the instrument for this struggle, therefore defines a class. It governs for the class and prepares for the end of the governments and no classes, the fulfillment of the proletariat's historical role. So only that so long as it, so long as its center does not break away from the membership. The party does not engage in sectarianism or break with its scientific theory. It understands class struggle. Theory and action. Given the current situation in which revolutionary energy is at an all-time low, the party's practical task is to examine the historic course of the struggle in its entirety, and it is a mistake to define this as an activity of literary or intellectual type, and to contrast it with who knows what descent into the thick of mass action, 2. Those who acknowledge our critical judgment that the present policy of the Stalinists is totally anti-classist and anti-revolutionary, and who see the Third International's bankruptcy as worse than the Second International's in 1914, must choose between two positions. Is it something we shared with Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and with the founding platform of the Comintern and the victors of the October that maybe needs to be dropped? We say no, only that the left has had to fight against since the need then needs to be dropped, whilst everything else subsequently betrayed by the Russians still stands. So essentially they're saying, hey, look, was Lenin's basis and methodology incorrect? And is it the fault of the Leninist the system that we have found this complete degradation of the Third International? Or was it a betrayal and it had nothing to do with the actual contents of Lenin? It had to do with things that came in and corrupted it. And they're saying they believe it was things that came in and corrupted it. Continuing. 3. A seriously mistaken maneuver after the First World War, prompted by the faltering revolutionary movements in the West, may be summed up as the various attempts to forcibly speed up the phase of insurrection and dictatorship by exploiting legalitarian, democratic, and laborist means. This mistake, which is mainly perpetrated at the alleged heart of the working class, at the point of contact with the social traders of the Second International, was bound to develop into a new form of political and social class collaboration with the capitalist forces, national and global, and become a new form of opportunism and a new form of betrayal. 4. Because it was felt the International Party, firmly rooted in the established theory and organization, should broaden its influence was granted to the enemies and traitors. And it ended up not only without the hoped for majority, but without the compact historical nucleus which had characterized the party of those days. The lesson is to never employ any such maneuver or method ever again. No mean feat. 5. It was futile to expect the situation in 1946, at the end of the Second World War, to be as fertile as it was in 1918, because of the greater severity of the counter revolutionary degeneration, because of the absence of strong nuclei capable of existing outside the wartime military, political, and partisan blocs, and because of the different policies adopted by the occupying forces to police the defeated countries. The situation in 1946 was clearly as unfavorable as it had been after the major defeats of the Communist League and the First International in 1849 and 1849 and 1871. 6. Since an abrupt return by the masses to an organizing activity suited to a revolutionary offensive is thus not conceivable, the best result that can be expected in the immediate future is a restating of the true proletarian and communist goals and demands, a reaffirmation of the lesson according to which every tactical improvisation which changes from one situation to the next under the pretext of taking advantage of unexpected factors within them is nothing but defeatism. 7. The stupid actualism activism reminder, this would be essentially the situation, the early development of the movement of the Situationist International and stuff like that, which adapts its gestures and moves to the immediate facts of the day. A veritable party existentialism must be replaced by the reconstruction of a solid bridge linking the past to the future, whose main lines the party sets out for itself once and for all, forbidding members, but especially leaders, from tendentious attempting to seek and discover, quote, new paths. 8. This bad habit, especially when it slanders or neglects doctrinal work and a restoration of theory, just as necessary today as it was for Lenin in 1914 to 18, assumes that action and struggle are all that matter, and ends up destroying Marxist dialectics and determinism, replacing the immense historical research into the rare moments and crucial points on which it is built, with a dissolute voluntarism, which then adapts itself in the worst and crassest of ways to the status quo and its wretched immediate perspectives. So, give me a second here. We're going to add this. And we're going to add this. Right. So, under conditions wherein revolutionary offensive is impossible, we should make sure to keep the kind's goals and demands steady. Changing principles at the whim of changing conditions and attempt to take the advantage of unexpected factors puts you on worse grounds. The party's membership, and especially leadership, should not attempt to seek out and, quote, discover new paths. He's only come during historic struggle through material acts. And of course, that's impossible when you're unable to engage in revolutionary offensive. Continuing. 9. This entire methodology of our seasoned class warriors can easily be reduced not to a new, original form of political practice, but rather a bad copy of old anti-Marxist positions. Its way of conceiving of history is idealist, a la Crochet, in that it believes the historical event is non-predictable by scientific laws, and that it is, quote, always right, to rebel against any prediction of human society's future course, or the rules which govern it. I highly doubt that that's what's on people's minds when they're doing this, but okay. Anyway, 10. The first priority is therefore to present again, supported by our classic party texts, the integrated Marxist vision of history, of the historical process, of the past revolutions that have happened up to now, and the characteristics of the one to come, which will see the modern proletariat overthrow capitalism and install new social forms. The key claims and demands must be presented again as they first appeared over a century ago in their original breadth and grandeur, in such a way as to liquidate the banal formulas with which they have been replaced, and not only by those in the Stalinist quagmire, but all by many others as well, all of them passing off for communism were in fact petty bourgeois, popular demand slanted towards achieving demagogic success. 11. Such an undertaking is long and difficult and requires years. On the other hand, the balance of forces in the global situation will take decades to be overturned. So every stupid and falsely revolutionary short term adventure seeking must be rejected with disdain, as is characteristic of those who do not know how to stand firm on the revolutionary position and who abandon the great highway for the blind alleys of short term success, as many examples in the history of deviation show. So I actually kind of want to cut in here with a pretty piercing question. What to do about climate change? Marx doesn't have anything written on climate change. Neither does Lenin. Nobody talked about the tactics or anything along those lines on those things. Now, Marx absolutely had a lot to say about nature and climate and stuff, but nothing about tactics and the stance that a communist party should take on climate change and the need in particular for immediate action, because the climate waits for no man. It does not wait for human history. Human history has fucked over the climate because bourgeois society is fundamentally incompatible with nature itself, as Marx pointed out over and over and over again. So, when they're talking about decades, I would say we do not have decades, number one. And number two, I can absolutely tell you with the strongest of knowledge that revolutionary subjective and objective conditions will be created by global warming. There's no question about it. The stresses that it will create are there. So, under those circumstances, without engaging in any struggle whatsoever, I can strongly say that climate change is going to be an inciting factor that we will have to go in and assume from the get go that we will have to be getting in on it. And beyond the fact that we have to get in on it and we have to agitate and organize on the base of it in a very direct way. Um, it's like we have to build tactics around it. Marxism is uniquely suited for critiquing bourgeois society and for dealing with the climate crisis because Marx centers climate, in fact, in many ways. I highly recommend John Bellamy Foster and, oh, what's his name from Japan? Um, Saito something or another. I've not actually read him yet. I've listened to a couple of his talks, but they're very good. He talks about degrowth. Yes, Kohei Saito. Kohei Sato? Yeah. Um, so I kind of want to just go and say, this questioning of immediacy, we are in a situation of immediacy. We don't have time to wait 40 years for conditions to get right, right? We don't even have 30 years. 2050 is like the time where we've probably overstayed our welcome, so to speak. And it's all just, we passed all hope once we got to that point, right? I mean, from there, it's just cleanup, just hoping that something survives and that people don't nuke each other and we're looking forward to a very violent 50 years from there as things just get worse and worse. And then, if anything's left, then they'll have to just deal. We'll see. But yeah, the historic dialect of mankind, that they're relying on for their party, and they're just saying sit and wait, seems very funny coming from 1952 when we're 70 years later and we're bearing down after essentially no developments on this level, right? There's been essentially no developments on this level. We're bearing down on apocalypse. So, and it's not necessarily their fault. They're not aware. Not, it wasn't until the 1970s that climate change became a popular, recognized issue. And it's certainly not until the 2000s, probably, I want to say, and especially the 2010s, that climate change became recognized as a potentially apocalyptic problem. Um, but I do want to say that I can sit here and say, without testing or anything along those lines, just because, I understand some of the results that climate change will cause, such as flooding and loss of land, fire, loss of food, loss of production, heat waves. The list goes on and on. I mean, I could sit here for the next hour and just talk about the Gulf Stream. Yeah. uh, right? These are unquestionably objective things. I don't need to have historic experience to go in and stand here and say, yeah, shit's going to fucking go down. And the party needs to be pre-prepared to take advantage of that and have a theory and have stuff that isn't just looking to the past to respond to this. It needs to be the most forward thinking of all, in fact. It needs to have already devised what is to be done before it all happens, right? So I don't agree with this. I don't agree with the idea that we should just sit back and just try to hold on to what we have. No. You need to identify what the future shit that's going to go down is going to be. Like the Vietnam War, which would be coming up pretty soon here, by the way. Um, and be on the preparation to respond to it, right? um, anyway, I wonder what these guys' response to Vietnam War was. Were the Vietnamese supposed to be engaging in revolutionary defeatism against their own state? Because they are supported by the imperialist USSR. Was that the plan? I do wonder what they would have to say about that. Continuing, the immediate revolutionary program. 1. With the gigantic recovery after the First World War, potent on a worldwide scale and in Italy resulting from the formation of Strong Party in 1921, it became clear that the most pressing postulate was the taking of political power, and that the proletariat could not take it by legal means but only by using armed action. That the best opportunity arises from military defeat of one's own country, and that political form which will follow victory is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Social and economic transformation occurs later, and its prior condition is the dictatorship. 2. The Communist Manifesto clarified that the social measures which would follow to be realized and accomplished, quote unquote, despotically, will differ. The road to communism, full communism, being very long, according to the level of development of the productive forces in the country where the proletariat conquers power and the rapidity with which this victory is extended to other countries. It indicated the measures appropriated then in 1848 for the most advanced European countries, and emphasized that they weren't the whole of the socialist program, but rather a group of measures which it qualified as transitory and meet variable and essentially, quote, contradictory. These are the 10 planks within the Communist Manifesto. It's the stuff that's saying, for example, the creation of a central bank, um, and things of that matter. 3. Subsequently, and this is one of the elements which misled some into supporting a more flexible theory, continually re-elaborated on the basis of historical evidence. Many of the measures originally viewed as the responsibility of the revolutionary proletariat were carried out by the bourgeoisie itself in this or that country, for example, free public instruction, state bank, etc. But this didn't authorize anyone to believe that the precise laws and predictions concerning the transition from the capitalist mode of production to the socialist one, with all its economic, social, and political forms, had changed. It merely meant that the immediate post-revolutionary period, the economy of transition to socialism, preceding the subsequent lower stage of socialism and the final higher stage of socialism, or full communism, would be different and slightly smoother. 4. Classical opportunism consisted in having people believe that all these measures, from the highest to the lowest, could be applied by the bourgeois democratic state, in response to pressure from, or even after having been legally conquered by, the proletariat. But if such were the case, these various measures, if compatible with the capitalist mode of production, would have been adopted in the interest of continuing capitalism and postponing its collapse, and if incompatible, the state would have never adopted them. 5. Today's opportunism, following a formula of popular and progressive democracy within the framework of the parliamentary constitution, has a different, worse historical task. Not only does it delude the proletariat that some of its own measures can be entrusted to an interclassist and multi-party state, that is, as far as yesterday's social democrats are concerned, it relinquishes the dictatorship, but it even drives the organized masses to fight for, quote, popular and progressive social measures which are directly opposed to those which the proletarian power has been committed ever since 1848 and the Manifesto. 6. Nothing better illustrates the total ignominy of such an involution than a list of the measures which will need to be drawn up in the future, when there's a real prospect of taking power in a country of Western capitalism, to replace, a century later, the list in the Manifesto, although its most characteristic measures would be still included. 7. Here is a list of such demands. Disinvestment of capital, namely assigned of a much smaller part of total production for goods which are instrumental and non-consumable. Basically, focus on the production on goods that are necessary and non-consumable. I'm struggling to understand what this means. They're saying to sell state owned funds of sorts, and in doing so assign much smaller part of total production to goods which are instrumental and non-consumable. Doesn't this mean like the means of production? Because those aren't means of subsistence. They're non-consumable, but they are also instrumental. I'm very confused by this, but maybe it's just because I'm not very good with economic terms and those sorts. But this doesn't particularly make sense to me. Anyway, increasing costs of production in order to be able to pay for as long as wages, market, and money survives. Higher wages for less working time. Increasing the cost of production in order to be able to pay for as long as wages, market. So are they? Okay, so it sounds like they're willing to increase wages by increasing the costs of living. Which is an interesting thought process. I don't understand. Drastic reduction of the working day to at least half of the hours currently worked by absorbing unemployment and antisocial activities. Okay, yeah. There we go. First one that I can understand just on the reading of it. Or maybe I do understand the previous two and I don't understand what they're going to with it. Reduction in the volume of production with a plan for lower production that focuses on the most necessary areas. Authoritarian control of consumption to counteract the promotion of dangerous and unnecessary goods. And the forceful abolition of activities dedicated to propagating a reactionary psychology. Okay, so essentially they are saying degrowth, for one. Then so an example of this would be with cars, right? Authoritarian control of consumption to counteract the promotion of dangerous and unnecessary goods. Let's talk about a car-centric society. We're right. We say, hey, cars are fucking bad. They're terrible for the environment. We want to get rid of cars and stuff. So we're going to deal with that. And then the forceful abolition of activities dedicated for propagating a reactionary psychology. Hollywood, that's a good example. Promoting bourgeois ideology, promoting news sites that are going in and calling for war, etc., etc. Continuing. Rapid breaking down of business and company boundaries with the forcible transfer not of personnel, but of objects of labor, productive activities, in order to move towards a new plan of consumption. Okay, this is connected with this one right here. And essentially it's saying, hey, the state takes over businesses really and forces them to combine, not in terms of personnel, but in terms of they're using the same stuff in order to do degrowth. Rapid abolition of welfare of a mercantile type in order to substitute with a social provision up to an initial minimum for non-workers. Okay, so a universal basic income. This has problems, but as a transitory step, there's no problems in my view with UBI. The problem with UBI under capitalism is that essentially it slows down the development of the productive forces potentially. And it also becomes a lever by which capital can control workers because rather than having all these different things, and capital is able to, and its state is able to force people to focus on the dole. Continuing. Cessation of building of houses and workplaces around cities, big and small, with a view of attaining a uniform distribution of the population in the countryside. Reduction in the congestion, volume, and velocity of traffic, and its prohibition when unnecessary. This is in starting the steps to deal with the division between town and country on a material level. This is something that capital is unable to deal with itself, and this is in fact a direct assault against capital itself. Resolute struggle through abolition of careers and qualifications against professional specialization and the social division of labor. Obvious, I mean, qualifications. I don't think that you can really get rid of qualifications. I am not qualified to drive a what do you call it? Forklift. That's it. That's it. One should probably have a qualification to drive a forklift. One should probably have a qualification to teach. One should probably have a qualification to drive generally. One should probably have a qualification to do quite a few different things. And it's not a thing of reinforcement of social division of labor to demand that people be able to demonstrate that they are capable of carrying out a particular form of labor through skills that they have learned. In other words, forms of complex labor, which Marx specifically talks about. Anyway, continuing. Obvious immediate measures akin to the political in order to bring schools, the press, all means of transmission of information, and the leisure and entertainment network under the authority of the communist state. 8. It is no surprise that the Stalinists and the like and their parties in the West are today calling for the exact opposite, and not only in their institutional or political legal demands, but also in their quote structural or economic social demands. This allows their actions to run parallel with those in the party which leads the Russian state and the ones connected to it, in which the task of the social transformation is to effect the passage from pre capitalism to full capitalism, with its entire baggage of economic, social, political, and ideological demands, all orientated towards the bourgeois zenith, and viewing with horror only the feudal and medieval nadir. These filthy renegades in the West are all the more contemptible insofar as that peril, still physical and real in parts of Asia and turmoil today, doesn't exist, as anyone can see the triumphant capitalarchy across the Atlantic, whose proletarians languish under the latter's civil, liberal, and national unitary heel. I'm going to take all this. I'm not sure how useful this is, and it questions it too, because it says, hey, look, this list isn't going to be applicable as conditions change, but it might be interesting to do compare and contrast of this versus the manifesto, and then take a look at our current conditions. So some of this stuff, it's like, yeah, we're talking about degrowth, we're talking about combating ecologically unhealthy things, etc. But other stuff like abolition of qualifications, that doesn't really make sense once you get down to it, because a qualification, at least in principle, is supposed to essentially be recognizing your capacity to engage in complex labor, which requires specialized knowledge, which is quite a few jobs. And then, we've got this divestment of capital, increasing the costs of production. I mean, I suspect that the thought process here is that essentially this creates pressure on the working class to demand uh, to demand higher wages of their own volition. But this kind of assumes that you've got a dictatorship of the proletariat already, and you should probably be aiming to abolish wages. So I'm not sure what the mindset here is, and there must be something I'm missing here as well, because you're supposed to be exploiting the exploiters, and then going in and developing the productive forces, while also developing socialism, right? I mean, I don't know what they're talking about here when they're trying to say that you should get rid of stuff from the state, and then, if this is what they mean by divestment, and then assign less to production of instrumental and non-consumable goods, which would include, for example, the means of production. Either things are kind of on their head, or I don't understand, or there's something else that's going on there. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not going to summarize this for now. Back to the text. Multiple revolutions. 1. As well as avoiding an eclectic approach to party tactics, the position of the communist left is to be clearly differentiated from the coarse simplification of those who reduce the entire struggle to the dualism forever and everywhere repeated of two conventional classes, the sole ones to act. The strategy of the modern proletariat movement consists of precise and established lines applicable to every hypothetical future action, which are related to the distinct geographical areas, quote unquote, into which the inhabited world is divided, into distinct temporal cycles. 2. The first classic area in which the interplay of forces gave rise to the irrevocable theory of the course of socialist revolution was England, From 1688, the bourgeois revolution suppressed feudal power and rapidly eradicated feudal forms of production. From 1840, the Marxist conception of the interplay of the three basic classes could be deduced: bourgeois landed property, industrial, commercial, and financial capital, and the proletariat struggling against the first two. 3. In Western Europe, France, Germany, Italy, smaller countries, the bourgeois struggle against feudalism lasts from 1789 to 1871, in the course of which situations arise in which the proletariat allies itself with the bourgeoisie when the latter engages in armed struggle to overthrow feudal power, but is an alliance in which the workers' parties already refuse to have their ideology confused with that of the economic and political apologias of bourgeois society. 4. In 1866, the United States of America finds itself in a situation Western Europe will be in post 1871, after having destroyed spurious capitalist forms through its victory over the rural and pro-slavery South. From 1871 onwards, radical Marxists in the entire Euro-American region reject all alliances and coalitions with bourgeois parties on any grounds whatsoever. 5. The pre-1871 situation, as in point 3, endured in Russia and in other countries of Eastern Europe until 1917, and here the challenge, already familiar from 1848 Germany, was posed: to provoke two revolutions and consequently to struggle to accomplish the tasks of the capitalist revolution as well. The conditions for passing directly to the second proletarian revolution was a political revolution in the West. This did not occur. This was talking about the German Revolution, which got strangled in its cradle. This did not occur, though the Russian proletarian class nevertheless succeeded in capturing political power on its own and holding on to it for a few years. 6. Whereas today, one can consider that in Eastern Europe, the capitalist mode of production and exchange has supplanted the feudal mode. In Asia, the revolution against feudalism and the even older regimes is in full swing, conducted by a united revolutionary front of bourgeois, petty bourgeois, and working class. 7. The analysis so far carried out amply illustrates that these attempts at double revolutions have had different historical outcomes: partial victory and total victory, defeat on the insurrectional terrain accompanied by a victory on the socio-economic terrain, and vice versa. What the semi-revolutions and counter-revolutions teach the proletariat is fundamental. Of the many examples, classic ones are Germany after 1848, double insurrectionary defeat for bourgeois and proletarians, social victory for the capitalist form and the gradual establishment of bourgeois power; Russia after 1917, double insurrectional victory for bourgeois and proletarians, February and October; social defeat of the socialist form, social victory of the capitalist form. 8. Russia, at least its European part, today has a fully capitalist mechanism of production and exchange, whose social function is reflected politically in a party and a government that has carried out all possible strategies for allying with the bourgeois parties and states in the Western regions. The Russian political system is a direct enemy of the proletariat, and it is not possible to conceive of any alliance with it, it being understood, however, that bringing about the victory of the capitalist form of production is a revolutionary result. 9. As regards the Asian countries, where localized agrarian economy of a patriarchal and feudalistic type still predominates, the struggle of the four classes, which is also political, is a factor in the victory of the international communist struggle, even when, in the short term, the outcome is the establishment of national and bourgeois powers, both through the formation of new regions where socialist demands will be in a position to be enabled later on, and through the blows that these insurrections inflict on Euro-American imperialism. Okay. The anti-capitalist revolution in the West. 1. Once agreed on how to this is a very good analysis, and I'm going to put this in here, and then I'm going to do ... And we're going to get this right here. Now, this no longer applies so much, but I think that there's something to be learned here about the character of these double revolutions, and in particular in regards to our own conditions. And I'll have to think about that more. Anybody who wants to give input on that, feel free to. This is a very interesting thought that needs to be developed further for the modern age. Because if we're talking about a revolution in the global north, we probably should be talking about revolution in the global south at the same, no, not probably. We absolutely need to be talking about revolution in the global south at the same time, and the interconnection between the two of these. Because the revolutions in their own right will be essentially happening at the same time. Continuing. The anti-capitalist revolution in the West. Once agreed on how to evaluate the global post-Second Imperialist War phase, with it clearly understood that the consolidation after two victories of the central imperialist capitalist powers does not, and cannot, exist alongside a likewise consolidated worker state building socialism in the East, their relationship being rather that between mature forms of capitalism and younger and newer forms, which may encounter each other both within the global mercantile economy and in armed conflicts in order to gain access to markets with as many fracture points as possible. Attention should be shifted to a transition in the West from full blown capitalism to socialist society, a revolution that will not be of the impure quote unquote double variety. Okay, so they're saying that it's a bad thing to have this double revolution. Uh, okay. Uh, Continuing. 2. Same as the data items on the Russian social economy and Stalin's quote official version have been traced back by ourselves to those that classically defines capitalism, dispelling the two theses that they are either socialist or a quote new form previously unknown to Marxism, the second thesis even more woeful than the first. So also does the data of the economy in the West, in particular in America, which is accepted as the quote official source of dirty propaganda in the quote free world, entirely tally with the Marxist description of capitalism, from which can be deduced the inevitable course, belying all apologetics about equilibrium and progress, of domestic production crises, wars over markets, revolutionary collapse, destruction of the capitalist state, proletarian dictatorship, and elimination of bourgeois forms of production. 3. Once installed, the capitalist mode of production can only sustain itself by continually expanding, not the endowment of resources and systems of the sort which would improve people's lives by reducing risks, suffering, and overwork, but the mass of commodities produced and sold. Since the population grows at a slower rate than the mass of products, it is necessary to convert the masses into major, of what is irrelevant, consumers and into new means of production in an ever repeating cycle. This is capitalism's essential feature, inseparable from the increased productive power of the material mechanisms which science and technology have made available. Every other feature pertaining to the statistical composition of classes and their interplay undoubtedly influential. The administrative, legal, political, organizational, and ideological superstructures is merely secondary and accessory, and does not alter the terms of its fundamental antithesis to the communist mode of production, which is contained unchanging and invariant since the time of the 1848 Manifesto and the proletarian revolutionary doctrine. Across the whole of the global economy, the characteristic indicators of the appearance of capitalism and the capitalist process, as established in Marx's monolithic evaluation, have occurred again and again and indeed intensified. Continuous, ruthless expropriation of all those in possession of reserves of commodities and means of production, artisans, peasants, small and medium traders, industrialists, hoarders, as per the laws derived mainly from the cycles of English capitalism, and as follows as regards the accumulation of capital and increased mass, both in absolute and relative terms, of the instruments of production, continuously and pointlessly, added to and replaced. Concentration in ever fewer, quote, hands rather than, quote, heads, pre capitalist concept, of those social forces in gigantic factory complexes and productive enterprises unknown before. Untrammeled expansion after national markets are formed of a global one. Dissolution of the world's last surviving enclaves of direct labor consumption. 5. This series of confirmations of a rhythm much faster than even our theoreticians expected is provided first and foremost by the data on the American economy, by United States production figures, the continuously rising domestic consumption there. The question is, can such a form of society keep on developing ad infinitum without any upsets? Or should we expect instead sudden jolts, deep crises, and shockwaves to shake the system to its very foundations, let alone the instability which exists at every level in this frenzied post war period, two massive world wars, and a huge interwar crisis which affected the entire economic system are answer enough, shattering as they do the image of the so called prosperous society, supposedly on its way to leveling living standards and individual wealth, composed of middle class without class extremes, and what's more, without any trade union struggles or any parties with anti constitutional programs. Nowadays, even the most banal assessment of the American substructure would admit that the old non bureaucratic, non military, federal administrative state, which used to be contrasted with the bellicose European power struggling for hegemony, is dead and buried. The figures for America in this connection, in both absolute and relative terms, far outstrip anywhere else in the world at any time in human history. 6. The description of such an economy, even if for the moment basing our deductions only on domestic relations, which are held to be stable within the acknowledged instability of international questions, the old theory of keeping out of the affairs of foreign countries, which are, quote, nothing to do with, end quote, America, on the other hand, having been renounced, leads directly to all the Marxist laws and the historic condemnation of the capitalist mode of production, which no one can stop in its course towards catastrophe and revolution. America's massive network of factories and plants, the biggest in the world, and the industrialization of every sphere of activity to the greatest degree possible, reveal a society which has overtaken all others as regards the power of, quote, dead labor, Marx. That is capital crystallized in machines, buildings, and the mass of raw and semi worked material over, quote, living labor. That is the unceasing activity of living people involved in production. The much boasted about liberty of the juridical level cannot disguise the weight and pressure of this corpse, governor of living beings. This is kind of presenting a Marx that is anti industrialization, which isn't the case. Marx is not anti industrialization, he is critiquing a particular form of industrialization. So I want to be clear about that and avoid any confusion here due to the words being used in this. And I don't know if they are confused or if they are assuming people are already aware that Marx is in giving critique of some, general character on that way, right? Basically, the dominance of living labor over dead labor in communism isn't, hey, we're not using labor imbued in machines anymore because, uh, because we're not using machines anymore. We're going back to primitivism or something like that. Instead, it's saying, okay, look, the labor imbued in our machines is a lot more efficient. We utilize things like renewables, solar power as a great example of this, which doesn't require labor to constantly produce it. It keeps on going. And there's a bunch of other stuff to do with this. And it's a social formation that makes it so living labor is in command of dead labor rather than the other way around, wherein workers are slave to the machines. That's really what it's about. That, the worker is slave to the machine rather than the machine being in tune with the worker, and acting as an external organ, as he put them, of the worker. Anyway, if anybody is confused about that, I'll find some stuff on those terms, but the way it's written is just not very clear, or it's ignorant. One of the two. Anyway, 7. The worker's improved standard of living considered as a mass of what he consumes reduced to an equivalent measure of value only serves to confirm the Marxist laws regarding the increased productivity of labor. The statistics around key dates 1848, 1914, 1929, 1932, and 1952 are shocking, but they still conform to our predicted cycle. If in 10 years it is boasted that wages have gone up by 280% while the cost of living has increased by 180%, it means that the worker with his 380 salary can buy 280. That is, the improvement is reduced to 35%. Over the same period, it has been admitted that productivity has gone up by 250%. Therefore, the worker who gives 3.5 times as much receives only 1 1/3. Exploitation and surplus value has gone up enormously. All this has made it abundantly clear that the law of increasing impoverishment doesn't mean a reduction in nominal or real wages, but rather that a larger amount of surplus value has been extorted and a greater number of people have had their last reserves expropriated. And this is this image here. Yeah, it's this one right here, and this is written 1952. So they ain't seen nothing yet. They ain't seen nothing yet. Continuing. 8. The increase in the productivity of labor, which over the course of capitalism's cycle in America has been tens of times over, means that with the same labor times 10 of times more products can be processed than before. At one time, the capitalist used to advance his capital in the proportion of 1 unit of labor in order to 1 of raw materials. Now is 1 of labor to 10 or 20 of raw materials. If his profit margin were to remain in the same proportion to the value of the product sold, his profit would likewise be 10 or 20 times greater. But for that to happen, the 10 or 20 times greater quantity of product would have to find purchasers. And so the capitalist contents himself with a smaller rate of profit, and increases the worker's remuneration, let's say doubles its real value per every tenfold increase in productivity. At the same time, the sale price goes down because the commodity contains 2 and not 10 units of labor, and customers are to be found among his own staff. Here we have the law of the fall of the rate of profit with the increase in the productivity of labor and the organic composition of capital, the constant part in relation to the whole, improved. Now all the deductions about the impossibility of this system dragging on indefinitely depend on the verification of the law of the declining rate of profit, which see dialogue with Stalin imprudently or pro-capitalistly dumped. Against these positions, even more so to the extent that they become more pressing and obvious, the communists oppose theirs. Let living labor dominate over dead labor. Let the increase in productivity be converted not into an equivalent amount of uses, but not actually harmful, products, which is madness, but into improving the conditions of living labor by drastically reducing the length of the working day. Okay. All right. So with this thing right here becomes a little bit more clear what they're calling for. They're calling for essentially an increase in the prices of raw materials in particular, so that wages are or fixing the price, fixing wages in some way to the price of raw materials, right? So that these things are no longer separated out so much, And as a result, wages skyrocket and there becomes a massive pressure. Um, Now, the question, of course, no, no, this is fine. Understanding in those terms makes this a lot easier to understand. Um, I'll put this in here. We we might go through it. Anyway, 9. America, which in 1850 Ingalls had already defined as the country in which a population doubles every 20 years, is also the country where productivity triples every 10 years, and is thus multiplied by 6 every 20 years, or with the law of geometric progression deemed by Stalin for Russia, ninefold. But this doesn't mean that European socialism isn't applicable there, but rather that it is much closer to the overproduction crisis and more exposed to the explosive pressure of capitalism. By making credit more available to proletarians who are thereby enabled to buy luxury items, quote, on tick, proletarians are turned, in an economic sense, into more perfect paupers, without savings to fall back on. Proletarian balance sheets are now no longer just about possessing nothing, but about mortgaging a mass of future labor in order to get back to owning nothing. Actually, a kind of partial slavery. At a social level, all this consumption corresponds to a network of influence, often of a corrupting and degenerate nature, which serve the interests of the ruling class, inculcating the habitual tendencies and ideologies that most suit it. The monstrous publicity and advertising machine constrains the proletariat to use its surplus earnings to buy articles of consumption which encapsulate false and often dangerous illusions. On top of capital's despotism in the factories, the personal liberty of prosperous America adds a further despotism and dictatorship over the exploited class by means of standardized, packaged consumption. It is a dictatorship which operates by creating absurd needs in order to keep workers busy in their free time and keep the wheels of commerce turning. The same effect is achieved by awarding a tiny share of factory dividends to supplemental annual salaries. The relevant statistics indicate that even in the best case scenarios, the additional earnings add up to no more than 5%, which is very quickly recuperated from the naive shareholder, quote unquote, who has been duped into working even harder. And yeah, this is entirely correct, as history has borne out, and we still see it today. Though I will say that the 2008 crisis in particular really was a manifestation of that at its worst points. And I'm pretty sure that there's previous stuff as well. Um, but continuing. 10. The theory of recurring and ever more serious crises has its base in the rise of productivity and the decline in the rate of profit. It will only become more it will only become redundant when those characteristic indicators of capitalism's course no longer exist. The latter certainly can't be said for America, and the same goes for Italian industries, where, for instance, in the steel sector, they want workers to produce not 80 tons per annum now, but 200 tons as in America. Who wouldn't prefer 4% of 200 rather than 5 of 80? The intrinsic economic crisis, that is, of the quote abstract America, as per Marx, that had to eat everything it produces, has been formulated and represents graphically in all its relentless, inexorable curves. A model based on commodities that oscillate around the average cost of bread leads us to conclude that today a pound of bread, which a worker acquires at a remuneration of 6 minutes of his working time, would have needed 17 minutes back in 1914. The working population has certainly significantly increased as a proportion of the population as a whole. So, how will American citizens gobble up 3 times the amount of bread they ate in 1914, maybe 10 times as much as in 1848? To avoid bursting, we advise them to stick to croissants. At a certain point, not a single pound more bread will be sold on the one hand. On the other, the worker will be sacked and won't be able to buy any bread in any case. This is why Black Friday will still come and will get even blacker. And the answer, of course, is imperialism, which is where they get there. 11. One solution is to stuff full of. Basically, they're saying, look, because productivity is increased, but nobody is interested in buying the product because it's like I can't eat 3 times as much bread. No matter how much you're wanting me to, no matter how much you're propagandizing me to buy more, consume, 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 I just can't consume that much. So what does it do? It has to go out, right? 11. One solution is to stuff full of bread the peoples who now you who up to now ate millet, rice, and bananas. Maybe Mao Mao got it wrong. I don't know what that's in reference to, but okay. And to do that, you begin by bombing anyone who prevents you from offloading your cargo, and then you bomb the millet, rice, and banana sellers. That's imperialism for you. The Marxist theory of crises and catastrophes seem to fit like a glove. So do its theories on imperialism and war, and the data from 1915 on which Lenin's imperialism was based is today provided by American statistics, which are 10 times as virulent. Among other things, these statistics make a comparison between the standard of living in America and other countries which trail behind it. First the Allies, then the enemies. But a pound of flour is worth 4 of those 6 minutes of bread time in America. It is worth 27 in Russia, say the American statistics. Even if the figure for Russia is actually less, what is sure is that in the eastern zone, the laws of rising productivity on the composition of capital and the declining rate still have a long way to go, much to the consternation of those who have misread the conditions and times scales of revolution. Having got the first piece of artillery in place and launched the first V2, maybe from the moon, what is certain is that you have to strike right at the heart of the American system in order to put a real brake on the crazy expansion of consumption and production, by showing it is indeed true that, quote, man does not live by bread alone. But if that but that if said man can produce his daily bread in 6 minutes, then if he works for over 2 hours, he is not a man, but a total idiot. Um, I'm actually going to add this. This is the, no, I'm going to add this to the Communist Mode production because this is actually a pretty good quote. It's basically saying, "Hey, um, well, surplus labor, right? The amount of hours that you have to work to reproduce yourself as a worker is far less than the amount that you're working." Anyway, 12. Though I want to be clear that it's not just you that you're reproducing, you're reproducing the conditions of society that is necessary to reproduce the working class as a whole. Um, so it's not just your bread or your water or your house or anything like that. So working class as a whole that you're reproducing, and therefore you can't just break it down into raw hours of the individual inputs that you do. You have to look at the all the inputs of all the workers put together. Anyway, 12. The question why there's no Communist Party with an uncompromisingly revolutionary program in America, even though such a program is eminently relevant and conditions have matured to the extent that total collapse seems possible, is a major historical problem which has global implications. The third opportunist wave, which split the Marxist movement in the period immediately after the First World War, has 3 aspects: reduction in the form of production developing in Russia to capitalism, abandonment of communist demands by the Russian political state, policy of military alliances by the latter, and of political alliances by the parallel parties in the West in pursuit of bourgeois and democratic demands. The abrupt transition from eulogizing the American capitalist regime as a friend and savior of the global proletariat to denouncing it as an enemy of the working class, as if it had only become such in 1946, was bound to further sabotage the revolutionary preparation of the proletariat in America, and put obstacles in the way of a genuine class party developing there. It will only be possible to move on from this situation by taking all the following steps: demonstrating that it is not socialism that is being built in Russia, that if the Russian state goes to war, it will not be for socialism, but because of imperialist rivalries, and above all, that in the Democratic West, popular or progressive objectives are not only of interest to the working class, but they actually serve to keep the rotten capitalist system on its feet. Um, this last one is still pertinent for today. We'll add this thing here, and I'll do a quick rundown. In the Democratic West, popular and progressive objectives are not of interest to working classes class interests. Now, I want to note that this is specifically in terms of objectives. We would still be fighting for progressive demands insofar as they align with Marxism. So, which is pretty much all progressive demands. It's just that by believing in bourgeois democracy, we support the capitalist system. Therefore, you shouldn't go voting for uh, what's that? The Democratic Progressive Squad or whatever it's called with AOC and Bernie and whatnot. Um, yeah, that's just a no go. It doesn't help the proletariat, not really. In fact, it quite hurts it because these people act as sheepdogs. We need to be building our own organization, not finding ourselves embroiled within a system which dashes away all of our organizing potential, and more specifically, our revolutionary potential. And even if we don't have that revolutionary potential yet, it's still there. And I don't mean to DSA right there. Though absolutely it's a case that those are the guys. When I'm talking about the squad in the Democrat Party, like AOC, Ilhan Omar, Bernie Sanders. There's probably one or two other people. I don't remember. Anyway, 13. In this lengthy work of reconstruction, which has to keep abreast of the advancing crisis of the Western and American form of production, for which all the decisive objective conditions have been met, and which, no matter what policy changes are made at a domestic or global level, can only be postponed for a matter of decades. Sure about that? We mustn't succumb to the mirage that new devices or alignments devised by so-called history scholars might provide a better explanation than that of the original Marxist construct, which, if correctly understood and observed, will be seen to have already been confirmed by historical events. The condition that shapes ideology, consciousness, and will is not a different problem, or one that is regulated by different influences to those under which events, interests, and forces take shape. The Communist Party fights for the future situation in which less working time will be spent on producing life's essentials, and works towards the future result by using all real development as leverage. That conquest, which seems rather paltry when expressed in hours, reduced to merely material calculation, represents a gigantic victory, the greatest possible, compared to the necessity of everyone slogging and slaving away. Then again, with capitalism and classes oppressed, the human species will still be subjected to needs dictated by natural forces, and freedom, as a philosophical absolute, will still remain a mad delusion. In the whirling vortex of today's world, whoever who, rather than seeking the guiding thread of this impersonal view of future conditions worked out over generations, would rather come up with new remedies inside their miserable heads and dictate new formulas, they are to be considered worse than the most damnable conformists and servitors of the capitalist system and those who preach its eternity. Okay. Uh, we already addressed this. They're saying that modernizer's bad. Okay. And that is the text on the historical contributions, the organic historical representation of Marxist revolutionary theory from the pamphlet Sul Filo del Tempo, number 1, May 1953, which included the historical invariance of Marxism, the false resource of activism, theory and action, the immediate revolutionary program, multiple revolutions, and the anti-capitalist revolution in the West. Thank you for attending the United Marxist Past reading section. Welcome to another human-read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server, linked below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, and the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship and communality, which can in turn produce the communist mode of production through the shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all these texts have to say about this, and at the end have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of this, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together and present it as a coherent whole in an educational video with associated notations. Today's reading will be the 1952 Contributions to the Organic Historical Representation of Marxist Revolutionary Theory. This video includes a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which is also posted in the pinned comment if you prefer to read it in text, or follow the link in the description to a read-only version of my Google Docs notes. This will summarize the contents of the text, but is no replacement for the actual reading itself for the sake of understanding the context. I'm reading these specifically and only for the pertinent content. I'm not including items that are not of interest for most conditions that are related to the topic at hand, but only historically, for example, the peasant question. In addition, in my reading, I supply my own commentary or critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. So let's move over to the analysis. The party's theory is based on solid fundamental principles which do not change generally, but will produce organizational and social force. As conditions which produce such fundamental change, previous formulations will take on a conservative form. But under those conditions are where new principles and doctrines can be discovered, as is under revolutionary objective and subjective conditions, producing slogans like all power to the Soviets. Right, so basically what happens is, okay, by and large, our doctrine shouldn't change, right? There's things that are obviously the case, like class struggle being the basis, right? Or value, or so on and so forth. Then there's stuff like, okay, in a particular time and place, this thing is true. And it remains true so long as conditions do not change. But the only time that conditions change in such a way that we are able to really go and update things is when, we're able to take action. Continuing. The party's theory, developed through praxis and the reversal thereof, does not need to be amended unless it is shown to be entirely false. Under circumstances that we expect to see something but do not, we can make a hypothesis about it until we come to proof through experience. For example, Kepler's law originally did not work for Uranus, resulting in the hypothesis of Neptune rather than the abandoning of Kepler's law or claiming that Uranus was somehow specially immune to them. In this vein, those trying to claim that a theory applies in one area but not another, for example, patriotic socialists, are more threat to those than those who reject class struggle altogether, as they are pseudoscientists who harm the development of theory and the understanding of the proletariat of their current conditions, just the same as those religious scientists who use pseudoscience to try and rescue their religion, creating distrust in science. The class struggle and Marxism's theories and predictions, developed during periods of intense historical changes, are validated through changes in the form of capital in response to the class struggle. Those seeking to change the form of class struggle in response, changing a winning strategy, harmed the assault on bourgeois society and the development of history and Marxism. Furthermore, social critique and the development of the theory of history and society was the result of class struggle and historic shifts. To deny this removes our ability to, as a class, understand our historical role as developments occur as a result of societal struggle. Individuals developing theory are unable to reach the masses who carry it out without conditions for the masses to learn from it. Therefore, the proletarian revolution understands that individual consciousness is unable to carry out historic change. Rather, concordant, harmonious direction of collective action, just like the scientific community, can. Marxism, as a science, is necessarily a coherent whole without internal consistencies or breaks. It is a science, and the economic theories of it are developments from the main trunk of the theory of value. Anything that breaches this ceases to be Marxism and is thus struggled against as enemies to the revolution and proletariat. However, this science is not merely dreaming about the future, but aiming to bring its theories into praxis and to be active in history, taking direct material steps to that reality to change the world. We understand that consciousness follows material conditions surrounding that consciousness, rather than the other way around, with all forms of social consciousness emerging from circumstances involved with economic relations, thus producing social classes. In this social class, no individual can perform a full analysis of the whole of class and its consciousness, as different groups experience different aspects of the economic relations. They can only have class consciousness insofar as they are part of the social class in the material act of struggle. In addition, the class as a whole cannot simply be consulted to determine their theory and consciousness, as such only arises out of material conditions. Thus, the need for the political class party to truly develop theory and consciousness as an active historic agent, capable of understanding the whole class consciousness of the proletariat, then taking action, and through that action, developing theory, right? Continuing. The class itself is a historic position in the class struggle for a new form of production, seeking to negate the old and in turn producing the conditions to negate itself. It is constantly altering in time and space, a product of a general process within any given mode of production. But through understanding the laws of motion of that mode of production, we can scientifically understand the class content of a given society. And as such, we do not need to consult individuals or the class as a whole about their experiences to understand their social role. The proletariat's dialectical role in this case is its own destruction in a statistical, quantitative, and qualitative sense, the full negation of class society. The party, as the instrument for this struggle, therefore defines the class, governing it as it prepares for the end of government in all classes, the fulfillment of the proletariat's historical role. Whoopsies. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. The party, as the instrument for this struggle, therefore defines the class, governing it and prepares for the end of government and classes, the fulfillment of the proletariat's historical role. This can only be done, though, as long as its center does not break away from the membership, engage in sectarianism, or break with its scientific theory. Under conditions where class struggle cannot develop through the party, the revolutionary offensive is impossible, and thus the ability to develop new theory is stymied. The party should keep the communist goals and demands steady and consistent, without changing principles at the whim of changing conditions, in an opportunistic attempt at taking advantage of unexpected factors. Doing such will harm the party's ability to act as general staff. In such conditions, the party's membership and especially leadership should not attempt to seek to quote unquote discover new paths, which can only be found during historic struggle through material acts. As an example of maintaining principles while developing the party for current conditions, the text presents some additions to the communist planks presented by Marx in the Communist Manifesto, for nations and the imperial core in particular, specifying that as conditions change, these too will change. This fundamentally can be summarized as a dictatorship of the proletariat with a transitional economy focused on degrowth via placement of living labor atop dead labor, via the maximization of efficiency of the means of production through the decommissioning of excess stock. Because, if you got a bunch of means of production, these things depreciate over time and you have to put labor into maintaining them. So what happens if you've got an overabundance of means of production while, it's not being used to its fullest? Well, you're best off decommissioning them in some form. Continuing. Centralization of what is necessary with full employment via shorter and more shifts, which maximizes what we already have while decreasing the labor costs to maintain vast amounts of content capital, which produces more than society needs. Maximization of leisure time and relative productivity. Attack on the bases of capitalism, such as the division between town and country and social division of labor, and to have the Communist Party led state control key industries to develop the social consciousness of society. So I translated their planks as best as I could out of economist language. So we've got liquidate capital investment in production of more productive forces, assign less total production of a given society to instrumental and non-consumable goods. That is to say, focus more on producing consumer goods and less on speed of development of productive forces. 2. Maximize wages as a cost of production for as long as wages are used. As Marx showed in his response to Lassalle's iron law of wages, this will not accompany an increase in prices of goods. Drastically reduce the length of the working day and have full employment, while liquidating jobs that are determined to be antisocial. Seek degrowth and abolish forms of activities which propagate reactionary psychology, for example, police, various kinds of social media work centered around propagating right wing views, bourgeois economist positions, and the list goes on. I'm not too sure what all is there. I just added some stuff that I could think of. 5. Forcibly combine businesses, their workforces, and means of production with intent to allow for this maximization of efficiency of use of the means of production. So rather than two companies with toothbrush creating machines, instead they're all working on one thing. But because there's full employment and because everybody's got it's working 24/7 because you have more shifts but less and more workers, right? The shifts are shorter, but there's more of them and you have more workers. And that should make it so these means of production are utilized to their fullest possible extent, as much as possible, with as little necessary spreading out. It's higher efficiency. Continuing. Institution of an unlimited basic, sorry, not unlimited basic income, but a UBI. Shoot, what is that called? Universal basic income. 7. Combat the division between town and country by prohibiting the creation of suburbs so as to force development on the countryside and then develop public transportation. This is, if we look at, for example, Korea and Seoul, it was made illegal to build housing in build anything more or less within an area of like 10 kilometers around Seoul. It kind of worked, but it certainly didn't work like this very well. I don't know if I said suburbs, which is what I translated this as, but the intent is pretty clearly to essentially make it so population equalizes and spreads out more than anything. Continuing. Abolish careers and qualifications so as to reduce the division of labor. This too would, of course, need to be discussed because I'm not going to be operated on by an unlicensed doctor. It's not happening. Bring all forms of information disseminate, but there are plenty of things that don't need this, you know. Bring all forms of information dissemination at all levels under the direction of the communist state. But these developed planks recognize the new focus in the global North's bourgeoisie, the maximization of relative surplus value extraction. Due to the continual increase of the productivity of labor without an accompanying increase of wages in the global North, there's room to struggle socioeconomically there by aiming to further reduce the length of the working day. This struggle should not seek to be a double revolution alongside the global South, as the latter can only achieve victory on an insurrectional terrain and not a socioeconomic terrain, so long as the global north remains as an imperialist power. Rather, the global north can achieve victory on both terms in immediacy and immediately obtain full socialist development, thus allowing the global south to start socialist development. For the victory of the global south, the global north's proletariat must disrupt capital. The victory of the proletariat in the global north rests on the Communist Party's ability to call for living labor to dominate over dead labor, stop overproduction, and instead increase the conditions of living labor through the reduction of the length of the working day. And this, by the way, is pure class war. The reduction of the length of the working day is a direct assault on capital and is one of the primary things which led to the various revolutions. And the fight for the 8-hour working day was it was a century long and incredibly bloody. Continue. This, however, should not be done through bourgeois democracy, which only supports the capitalist system. Popular and progressive objectives are not of interest to working class's class interests in terms of objectives. When those progressive demands, for example, the liberation of LGBTQ plus peoples, are posed, it is brought into the movement insofar as it aligns with the class struggle. The agitation on the basis of reducing working time, increasing leisure, and increasing access to consumer goods all at the same time can create subjective conditions for struggle in the global north if handled correctly. And that can only be done through a correct minded party. And that is the summary of the text that is to follow. I hope that you stick around for the audiobook and commentary. Thank you.